Life can change in an instant. One moment, you're at the top, looking down at those who struggle. The next, fate reminds you that no one is untouchable. When Eleanor, a hardworking single mom, was humiliated by Richard, a wealthy businessman, she had no idea that karma was waiting just around the corner. He mocked her for her financial struggles, treating her like she was invisible. But fate has a way of balancing the scales. What happens when the man who once laughed at her finds himself at rock bottom? This is a story about pride, struggle, and unexpected justice. Eleanor Walker was used to tough days. She had 2 jobs, 1 old car that barely worked, and a 6-year-old son, Oliver, who was the light of her life. She lived in a small apartment in a rundown part of town, but she did everything in her power to make it feel like a home. Her morning started at 5 a.m. She would prepare Oliver's breakfast, get him ready for school, and then head to her first job as a waitress at an upscale restaurant. The job barely paid enough to cover rent, but it was the best she could get. After her shift ended at 3 p.m., she would rush across town to work at a grocery store until late at night. She never complained, but she was exhausted. Richard Coleman, on the other hand, was the opposite of Eleanor. He was a millionaire, the owner of a successful real estate company. He wore expensive suits, drove a sleek black sports car, and spent his time at luxury hotels and private parties. He had never known struggle. In his mind, people like Eleanor simply didn't work hard enough. It was a Friday afternoon when their paths crossed in a way that neither of them would forget. Eleanor had just finished her morning shift and was standing outside the restaurant waiting for her bus. Her feet hurt from standing all day, and her uniform was stained from a spilled drink. She clutched her purse tightly, counting the few dollars she had left until payday. That's when Richard pulled up in his luxury car. He stepped out, looking polished and confident, flashing his gold watch as he checked the time. As he approached the restaurant, his eyes landed on Eleanor. He gave her a disgusted look, chuckling under his breath. "You know," he said loud enough for her to hear, "some people just don't have ambition. You spend your life working for pennies, and you're still standing here waiting for a bus? Pathetic." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't say anything. She had dealt with people like him before, people who had everything handed to them and thought they were better than the rest. But what Richard didn't know was that life has a way of humbling even the richest man, and his lesson was about to come faster than he could have imagined. Eleanor clenched her fists, forcing herself to ignore Richard's cruel words. People like him had never known struggle, never had to choose between rent and groceries. She wouldn't let his arrogance get to her. She straightened her shoulders and boarded the bus, staring out the window as the city blurred past. The weight of the day's exhaustion settled on her, but she had no time to rest. Arriving at her apartment, she took a deep breath before stepping inside. The small, dimly lit space smelled of instant coffee and laundry detergent. Oliver, her 6-year-old son, ran to her with open arms, his bright smile the only thing keeping her going. "Mom, there's a fair in town. Can we go?" His excitement was contagious, but Eleanor's heart sank. She forced a smile and ruffled his hair. "Maybe next time, sweetheart," she said softly, knowing full well that next time might never come. As she set down her purse, her eyes landed on a red eviction notice taped to the door. Her breath hitched. She ripped it off, scanning the paper. Final warning, payment due in 3 days. Her stomach twisted. She had been behind on rent for months, but her landlord had been patient. Until now. She only had a few days to come up with the money, or she and Oliver would be homeless. Determined not to panic in front of her son, she took out her phone and called her manager at the grocery store. "Please, I need extra hours. Anything you can give me." Her manager sighed. "I can put you on the night shift for the next few days. It's all I have." Eleanor exhaled in relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thank you," she whispered before hanging up. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Coleman's life was the complete opposite. He walked into an extravagant penthouse where his assistant handed him a glass of aged whiskey. His latest real estate deal had just been finalized, adding millions to his name. He smirked as he checked his luxury watch, admiring the gold-plated details. "Success is simple," he muttered to himself. "Some people just don't try hard enough." Later that night, Richard attended a lavish business party at a 5-star hotel. The champagne flowed, and laughter echoed as wealthy executives clinked glasses. Richard, dressed in a tailored black suit, leaned back in his chair, basking in admiration from his peers. One of his business partners chuckled. "I saw you outside that restaurant today, talking to that woman. What was her name?" Richard scoffed. "No idea. Just some waitress waiting for a bus. Some people live like that their whole lives." He smirked, shaking his head. "You either make it or you don't. Simple as that." His friends laughed, raising their glasses to toast his success. But life had a way of humbling even the proudest men, and Richard was about to learn that the hard way. The next morning, Eleanor barely had time to sleep before she was up again, dropping Oliver off at school. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Be good today, okay?" He nodded, but his eyes held a sadness she hated to see. She knew he felt the weight of their struggles, even though she tried to shield him from it. At work, Eleanor pushed through her double shift, serving customers with a smile even when her legs ached. She noticed a man struggling with his meal, a frail, elderly gentleman who reminded her of her late father. She quietly walked over and offered to replace his food. "Don't worry about the cost," she whispered, setting down a warm plate. The man's eyes welled with tears. "You have a kind heart," he said. She smiled, but deep down she wondered how much longer she could keep up the act. Across town, Richard's world was beginning to shake. A government audit had flagged one of his biggest real estate projects for fraud allegations. His company's accounts were frozen. His assets were under investigation. It happened so fast that he barely had time to react. His assistant rushed into his office, panicked. "Richard, the bank just rejected the company's transactions. Investors are pulling out. The media is already running the story." Richard's head spun. "This is a mistake," he snapped. But the calls kept coming, clients canceling deals, banks freezing funds, lawyers advising him to stay low. By the end of the day, he wasn't a celebrated businessman anymore. He was a man on the verge of losing everything. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his bank manager. "Mr. Coleman, I regret to inform you that due to the legal complications, we've had to seize your personal accounts as well." His jaw clenched. "You can't do that." "I'm sorry, sir. Until the investigation is cleared, there's nothing we can do." For the first time in his life, Richard felt powerless. Days passed and things only got worse. His name was all over the news. His luxurious penthouse? Gone. His company? On the brink of bankruptcy. He reached out to his wealthy friends for help, but they all avoided him, not wanting to be linked to his scandal. The same people who once toasted to his success now pretended they didn't know him. With nowhere else to go, Richard drove around the city, trying to process his downfall. He pulled into a parking lot, staring blankly at the rundown buildings surrounding him. His stomach growled, but for the first time in years, he had no money, no credit cards, no way to afford even a simple meal. He spotted a small diner across the street. It wasn't one he would have ever stepped into before, but today pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He pushed open the door, the scent of coffee and fried food filling the air. He hesitated, then approached the counter. "Excuse me, do you have any small jobs? Something quick?" The waitress turned around. It was Eleanor. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Richard felt shame. She recognized him instantly, but instead of mocking him, she simply studied his face. He was tired, desperate, hollow. The arrogance was gone. Eleanor crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "I thought people like me just didn't try hard enough." Richard swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong." She sighed, glancing at the half-empty diner. "I can't offer you much, but we need someone to wipe tables and wash dishes." Richard nodded quickly. "I'll take it." For the first time in his life, Richard knew what struggle felt like, and karma had a funny way of teaching lessons. Richard never imagined his life would come to this. Standing in the dimly lit diner, wearing a stained apron, scrubbing plates, and clearing tables for minimum wage. The once powerful businessman, who once mocked people like Eleanor, now worked in the same kind of place he used to dismiss without a second thought. His hands ached from hours of labor, the hot water stinging his skin as he washed dish after dish. The other staff whispered about him, recognizing his name from the news. Some laughed at his downfall. Others simply ignored him. He had gone from being a wealthy CEO to just another struggling worker trying to get by. Eleanor didn't treat him cruelly, but she didn't go out of her way to make things easier for him either. She gave him orders without hesitation, just like any other employee. "Table 5 needs clearing," she'd say. Or, "Make sure the counters are wiped down before your shift ends." Richard obeyed without complaint. For the first time in his life, he had no power, no influence, no privilege to lean on. Days passed, turning into weeks. Richard's situation didn't improve. His assets remained frozen, and his lawyers informed him that the fraud allegations could take months or even years to clear up. He had no home, no car, no financial safety net. One night, as the diner was about to close, Eleanor noticed Richard sitting alone at a corner table, staring at an untouched plate of food. His face looked hollow, his once pristine suit now replaced by a cheap, worn-out shirt he had picked up from a thrift store. She approached cautiously. "You okay?" she asked. Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Do I look okay?" Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat across from him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the humming of the refrigerator and the distant chatter of the last remaining customers. Finally, Richard spoke. "I had everything," he whispered. "I had power, money, respect. And in the blink of an eye, it's gone." His voice wavered, filled with something Eleanor had never heard from him before. Regret. She studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Tell me something," she said. "If you could go back, would you do things differently?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His mind flashed back to all the times he looked down on people like her, all the moments he believed himself to be superior. He thought about his arrogance, his wastefulness, his complete lack of empathy. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I was too blinded by my own success to see what really mattered." Eleanor sighed. "Money isn't everything, Richard. It can disappear overnight. And when it does, the only thing you have left is the kind of person you are." For the first time, her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The next day, Eleanor had a surprise waiting for her at work. When she arrived, her boss, Mr. Thompson, was already there, looking pleased. "Eleanor, I need to talk to you," he said, leading her into the back office. She braced herself, fearing bad news, but what he said next shocked her. "Our company has been struggling with new management. We need someone reliable, someone hardworking, someone with experience in handling real challenges. I've been watching your work ethic, and I believe you'd be a perfect fit as our new operations manager." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. A manager? A real salary, benefits, stability? It was more than she had ever dreamed of. She swallowed hard. I don't know what to say." Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Say yes." Tears pricked at her eyes and she nodded. "Yes." As soon as she finished her shift at the diner, she rushed home to tell Oliver the good news. He jumped into her arms, beaming. "Does this mean we won't have to move again, Mom?" She hugged him tight. "No, sweetheart. We're going to be okay." That night, as Eleanor packed away her work uniform for good, she heard a knock at her door. She hesitated before opening it, then froze. It was Richard. His usual confidence was gone. He looked tired, desperate, a shell of the man he used to be. I heard about your promotion," he said quietly. "Congratulations." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "How did you find out where I live?" Richard gave a half smile. "I asked around." Then his face grew serious. "Eleanor, I need help." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Help? From me?" Richard exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I was awful to you, but I have nothing. No one will hire me. My money is still frozen, and He hesitated, struggling to admit it. "I don't even have a place to stay." Eleanor stared at him, remembering all the things he had said to her, all the times he had made her feel small. The easy choice would have been to turn him away, to let him suffer as he once made her suffer. But something stopped her. She knew what it felt like to have no one to turn to. She had lived that reality for years. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I can't give you money, and I can't fix what you did. But," she sighed, I might be able to get you a job. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. You, you would do that? I don't know if you deserve it, Eleanor admitted. But I do know this. You have a choice now. You can prove that you're more than the person you used to be, or you can stay stuck in your own misery. Richard nodded slowly. I'll take whatever I can get. Eleanor spoke to Mr. Thompson the next day. I know someone who needs a second chance, she said carefully. He's made mistakes, but I think he's ready to change. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Who is it? She hesitated. Richard Coleman. Mr. Thompson blinked in shock. The real estate guy? The one who lost everything? Yes, Eleanor said, and he's willing to start from the bottom. After a long silence, Mr. Thompson nodded. Fine, but he starts as an entry-level worker. No special treatment. Eleanor relayed the news to Richard, expecting him to refuse. But to her surprise, he accepted without hesitation. On his first day, he swallowed his pride, took a seat at a desk, no longer the boss, but just another employee trying to make a living. And for the first time in his life, he finally understood the value of humility. Weeks passed, and Richard transformed. He arrived early, worked hard, and never complained about starting from scratch. Eleanor, now his superior, treated him fairly, but she didn't hold back on expectations. You wanted a chance, she reminded him. Prove you deserve it. He did. And over time, something unexpected happened. Richard grew into a better man. He learned to listen, to respect others, to appreciate hard work. One evening, as they walked out of the office, he turned to Eleanor. I used to think success was just about money, but now I think it's about the kind of person you become. Eleanor smiled. Took you long enough to figure that out. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, but better late than never. And for the first time in years, Richard felt truly rich, not because of money, but because of the lessons life had finally taught him. Time passed, and the world moved on. The scandal that had once dominated the news cycle faded into the background, replaced by new headlines. But for Richard and Eleanor, the consequences of everything that had happened continued to shape their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. Richard's journey toward redemption. For the first time in his life, Richard understood what it meant to struggle, to start from nothing, to work for every small achievement. The lessons life had thrown at him had been harsh, but they had been necessary. He continued working at Mr. Thompson's company, gradually proving that he wasn't just looking for an easy way back to wealth. He showed up early, stayed late, learned from others, and took advice humbly, things he had never done before. There were days when the old arrogance tried to creep back in, but he quickly pushed it away. He had lost too much to allow himself to return to the man he used to be. One afternoon, as he was finishing up some reports, Mr. Thompson walked past his desk and stopped. You've been doing well, Richard, he said. Richard looked up, surprised. Thank you, sir. Mr. Thompson nodded. I had my doubts about hiring you, but Eleanor spoke for you. And now I see why. Keep it up. Those words meant more to Richard than any deal he had ever closed as a CEO. He had built a name for himself once through power and wealth. Now he was earning respect through honesty and hard work. Eleanor's new role as operations manager changed her life completely. For the first time, she had a salary that allowed her to breathe. The days of scraping together coins to pay for rent were gone. She could buy Oliver a warm jacket for the winter, get him books for school, and even take him to the fair he had wanted to visit so badly before. One evening, as she tucked Oliver into bed, he looked up at her with a soft smile. Mom? Yes, sweetheart? We're safe now, aren't we? Eleanor felt tears welling up, but this time, they weren't tears of exhaustion or despair. They were tears of relief. She stroked his hair gently. Yes, baby, we're safe. She had worked so hard for this moment, and finally it had come. One Friday evening, Eleanor found herself walking alongside Richard as they both left work. It had become a habit, sharing brief conversations after a long day. You ever think about going back? Eleanor asked casually. Richard frowned. Back where? To real estate. To your old world. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I used to. At first, I told myself I'd rebuild everything. Make it back to the top. He shook his head, smiling to himself. But now? I don't think I want to. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Eleanor studied him carefully. The man standing in front of her was not the same man who had once mocked her outside that restaurant. "What do you want now?" she asked. Richard thought for a long moment. Then a small, thoughtful smile crossed his face. "I think I want to build something honest this time. Something that actually helps people." Eleanor smirked. "So, a good rich guy?" Richard laughed. "If I ever get rich again, yeah, a good rich guy." They both chuckled, standing there in the golden glow of the setting sun. Months passed, and Richard slowly rebuilt his life. But this time, he did it the right way. Instead of diving back into real estate deals driven by greed, he partnered with a nonprofit focused on providing affordable housing for low-income families. He used his knowledge of property and business to help rather than exploit. Eleanor watched from a distance, proud of the man he was becoming. They weren't exactly friends, but they had a deep understanding of each other now. Respect. One day, as she was walking into the office, she heard a familiar voice. "Eleanor." She turned to find Mr. Thompson standing behind her, holding out an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." She tore the envelope open, her eyes widening as she read the letter inside. "Eleanor, your hard work and leadership have not gone unnoticed. We are pleased to offer you a position as Director of Operations." Her breath hitched. Director? She had never even dared to dream this far. She looked up at Mr. Thompson, speechless. He smiled. "You earned it." Eleanor felt overwhelmed with gratitude. It wasn't just about the title. It was about everything it represented. She had gone from being a struggling single mother, working 2 jobs just to survive, to a respected leader in her field. She had won. The next morning, Eleanor walked into her new office, still in disbelief. Sitting on her desk was a small note. It was from Richard. "I told you some people just aren't built for success. I was wrong. You are. Congratulations." Eleanor smiled, shaking her head. Maybe, just maybe, people really could change. This story isn't just about money and success. It's about the power of humility, resilience, and second chances. Richard learned the hardest lesson of his life, that wealth means nothing if you don't have character, integrity, and respect for others. He lost everything, but in doing so, he gained wisdom, empathy, and a chance to rebuild the right way. Eleanor, on the other hand, proved that hard work, kindness, and perseverance can lead to success, even when the odds are stacked against you. Life has a way of bringing balance. Arrogance is punished, kindness is rewarded, and karma never misses a lesson. As Eleanor stepped out of the building, she saw Richard helping a struggling mother into his nonprofit's office. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. She nodded back. 2 people whose lives had once been worlds apart, now bound together by fate, by struggle, by redemption. And in that moment, both of them knew they had truly won. Life is unpredictable. One day you might be on top, the next struggling to survive. But what defines you isn't your wealth. It's how you treat people. Never underestimate kindness. Never let arrogance blind you. And never forget, karma is always watching. If this story moved you, comment your thoughts, like, subscribe, and share to spread the message. Because everyone deserves a second chance.